Alice and Mark had been in love for as long as anyone could remember. Their romance began back in university, where they were inseparable. Mark was known for his sharp wit and charm, while Alice was admired for her kindness and determination. They both had big dreams of building a future together, but life had a way of testing their love. 2 years after graduation, Mark proposed to Alice on a quiet evening. He had saved up his meager earnings from odd jobs to buy a simple ring. Tears filled Alice's eyes as she accepted, and their friends cheered. The two were hopeful for a bright future despite their humble beginnings. After the wedding, they moved into a small apartment in the heart of Lagos. The walls were thin, and the furniture was second-hand, but they made it their own. They laughed about the leaking roof and shared late-night dreams of better days. Alice got a job as a secretary at a small startup company. She worked long hours, often coming home exhausted. Meanwhile, Mark was job hunting, moving from one interview to another with no luck. "It's just temporary," Alice would say, holding his hand. "We'll get through this together." But weeks turned into months, and the weight of Mark's unemployment began to strain their relationship. The bills piled up, and their once joyful home grew tense. Mark felt ashamed and frustrated. "I should be the one providing for us," he muttered one evening, staring at the ceiling. Alice comforted him, but deep down she worried too. One fateful day everything changed. Alice's boss called her into the office to introduce her to John, a wealthy businessman who had just signed a big contract with the company. John was tall, confident, and exuded power. He smiled warmly at Alice, and something about his gaze lingered a bit too long. After their first meeting, John began visiting the office more frequently. He always found a reason to talk to Alice, complimenting her work and asking about her life. At first, Alice thought nothing of it. But as the weeks went by, his questions became more personal. "Do you have a husband?" he asked one day, leaning against her desk. "Yes," Alice replied with a polite smile. "His name is Mark." "And what does Mark do?" Alice hesitated, feeling a pang of embarrassment. "He's looking for a job right now." John nodded, his eyes gleaming with an idea. "I might be able to help," he said casually. "Let's discuss it over dinner." Alice felt a strange unease but agreed. She told herself it was for Mark, for their future. That evening, she met John at an upscale restaurant. She was overwhelmed by the opulence, the sparkling chandeliers, the soft music, and the aroma of expensive dishes. Over dinner, John listened as Alice spoke about Mark's struggles. When she finished, he leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "I can help your husband. I have connections and I can get him a high-paying job." But he paused, his eyes locking onto hers. "There's one condition." Alice's heart raced. "What condition?" she asked, though she feared the answer. "You spend one night with me," John said, his tone calm as if he were discussing a business deal. Alice's fork clattered onto her plate. She stared at him, her cheeks burning with shame and anger. "How dare you?" "Think about it," John interrupted, his voice still smooth. "Your husband gets the job he's been dreaming of. You both climb out of this struggle. All it takes is one night." Alice left the restaurant without saying another word, her mind spinning. She couldn't sleep that night. She thought about Mark, about their dreams, and about the life they had envisioned. Could she sacrifice her dignity for their future? Days turned into weeks, and the pressure mounted. Mark was growing more despondent, and Alice felt helpless. The bills weren't going away, and she couldn't bear to see the man she loved so defeated. Finally, with a heavy heart, she called John. "I'll do it," she whispered. That night was the longest of her life. She felt a deep sense of betrayal, to herself, to Mark, and to the vows they had exchanged. But she told herself it was for the greater good. True to his word, John arranged for Mark to get a job at a prestigious company. The salary was beyond anything they had ever imagined. When Mark came home with the news, he was beaming. "Alice, we're going to be okay," he exclaimed, lifting her off the ground in a joyful embrace. Alice forced a smile, swallowing the guilt that threatened to choke her. With Mark's new job, their lives began to change. They moved to a nicer apartment, bought new furniture, and even started attending social events with Lagos's elite. For the first time in years they felt secure. But Alice's connection with John didn't end that night. He continued to call her, to send her gifts, and to remind her of their shared secret. At first, Alice tried to distance herself, but John had a way of pulling her back. His wealth and influence were intoxicating, and soon their meetings became more frequent. Mark, oblivious to the truth, was thriving in his new role. He often thanked Alice for supporting him during the tough times. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said, kissing her forehead. Alice's heart ached every time he said those words. She had done something she could never confess, something that had saved them but also bound her to a man she despised. The transformation in Alice and Mark's lives was nothing short of remarkable. Once burdened by unpaid bills and sleepless nights, they were now living in an upscale apartment in Victoria Island, Lagos. Mark had quickly risen in his new company, earning promotions and gaining respect in the business world. Alice, still working as a secretary, was no longer the overworked, stressed woman she once was. Her days were now filled with charity luncheons, shopping trips, and social gatherings with Lagos's wealthiest families. The new lifestyle came with its perks. Their home was adorned with fine furniture, the refrigerator was always stocked with imported goods, and they attended extravagant parties nearly every weekend. Mark couldn't stop marveling at how far they had come. "Can you believe this, Alice?" he asked one night as they returned from a gala. "We're living the life we always dreamed of." Alice forced a smile, her heart heavy with the weight of her secrets. She had done what she thought was necessary, but the cost of her decision was becoming clearer with each passing day. John had not disappeared from her life. On the contrary, he had become a constant presence. Whenever she thought she could move on, he would call or send her a gift, a designer handbag, an expensive necklace, or even tickets to exclusive events. He always found a way to remind her of their shared history. At first, Alice tried to keep her interactions with John professional, but he made it impossible. "You can't pretend I don't exist, Alice," he told her one afternoon over lunch. "We have something special, you and I." "There's nothing special about this," Alice replied, her voice shaking. "I love my husband." John laughed, leaning back in his chair. "You can love him all you want, but we both know you'll keep coming back to me." Alice hated how right he was. The power John held over her was undeniable. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, and now she was trapped in a web of lies. As the years went by, Alice and Mark have 2 daughters at this point. Their social circle grew. They mingled with politicians, CEOs, and celebrities. They hosted lavish parties at their home, complete with live music and gourmet catering. To the outside world, they were the picture of success, a power couple who had worked their way to the top. But cracks were beginning to form in their perfect facade. Mark started noticing small changes in Alice. She was always on her phone, often stepping out of the room to take calls. She grew distant, her laughter no longer as genuine as it once was. And then there were the late-night outings, which she claimed were for women's club meetings or work obligations. At first, Mark brushed off his suspicions. He told himself that Alice was simply adjusting to their new lifestyle. But as time went on, the doubts became harder to ignore. One night, as they lay in bed, Mark turned to her. "Alice, is everything okay?" he asked. "Of course," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "Why do you ask?" "You've been different lately," he said carefully. "Distant." Alice laughed nervously. "It's just the stress of everything. You know how busy life is now." Mark nodded, but he wasn't convinced. The tipping point came when Mark noticed Alice's phone buzzing late at night. He glanced at the screen and saw a name he didn't recognize. John. His heart sank as a wave of jealousy and anger washed over him. Who was this man? And why was he calling his wife at such an odd hour? Mark didn't confront Alice immediately. Instead, he began watching her more closely. He noticed how protective she was of her phone, how she always seemed nervous when she received a text or call. One evening, while Alice was in the shower, Mark couldn't resist his curiosity. He picked up her phone and scrolled through her messages. What he found confirmed his worst fears: intimate conversations with a man named John, conversations that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Mark's hands trembled as he set the phone down. His mind raced with questions and emotions. How long had this been going on? Did Alice ever love him? What about their children? He decided to investigate further. One day, while Alice was out, Mark took strands of hair from their daughter's brushes and sent them to a hospital for DNA testing. He told himself it was a paranoid overreaction, but deep down he feared the truth. When the test results came back, Mark's worst nightmare became a reality. The report confirmed that neither of the girls was biologically his. Mark stared at the papers, his vision blurring with tears. His heart felt like it had been ripped from his chest. He thought of all the moments he had shared with his daughters, the bedtime stories, the family vacations, the hugs and kisses, and realized it had all been built on a lie. For days, Mark couldn't bring himself to confront Alice. He avoided her, throwing himself into work and drowning his sorrows in alcohol. But the anger inside him grew with each passing day. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and utterly broken. Mark couldn't bear to look at Alice the same way anymore. Every time he saw her, the betrayal burned in his chest. The results of the DNA test had confirmed what he had suspected. The daughters he had loved, nurtured, and called his own were not his. He began pulling away from his family, retreating into himself. His once cheerful demeanor turned cold and distant. Alice noticed the change but chalked it up to work stress. "Are you okay, Mark?" she asked one evening as he sat silently at the dinner table, his food untouched. "I'm fine," he muttered, his tone sharp enough to silence further questions. But Mark was far from fine. His mind was a storm of anger and confusion. He wanted to confront Alice, to scream at her, to demand answers, but every time he opened his mouth, the words caught in his throat. Instead, he turned his frustration toward their daughters. It started small, a scolding here, a harsh tone there, but it quickly escalated. Mark began looking for reasons to punish them, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface. The girls, innocent and unaware of the truth, didn't understand why their father had become so cruel. One evening, as Alice was out attending yet another social event, Mark called the girls into the living room. They stood before him, trembling under his intense gaze. "Do you love me?" he asked, his voice cold. "Yes, Daddy," the older one, Lily, said softly. Her sister, Emma, nodded beside her. Mark leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't," he hissed. "Because I'm not your real father." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The girls stared at him, confused and frightened. "What do you mean?" Emma whispered. Mark's face twisted with a bitter smile. "Ask your mother," he said before storming out of the room. The girls didn't understand what was happening, but they knew something was terribly wrong. That night they huddled together in bed, too scared to sleep. But emotional abuse was only the beginning. He began to assault Emma and her sister Lily. The trauma silenced the girls, who were too frightened to speak out. Mark's threat kept them compliant. "If you tell anyone, I'll kill you and kill myself." As the days passed, Mark's behavior grew more erratic. They lived in constant fear, flinching at every loud noise, every sharp word. The once loving father they knew had become a monster. One evening, as Alice returned home, she noticed the girls sitting quietly in their room, their faces pale and drawn. "What's wrong, my loves?" she asked, kneeling beside them. "Nothing," Lily said quickly, her eyes darting to Emma, who nodded in agreement. Alice's heart ached. She could sense that something was wrong, but she didn't press them. She assumed it was school stress or a passing phase. But the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. One night, Alice came home earlier than expected. As she entered the house, she heard muffled cries coming from the living room. Her blood ran cold as she followed the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. What she saw froze her in place. Mark was towering over the girls, his face twisted in anger. Lily was crying, and Emma was cowering behind her sister. "What is going on here?" Alice demanded, her voice shaking. Mark turned to her, his expression dark. "Stay out of this, Alice," he growled. "No," she said firmly, stepping forward. "They're my children, and I won't let you hurt them." "They're not your children," Mark spat, his words laced with venom. "Not mine, at least." Alice's eyes widened in shock. "What are you talking about?" Mark pulled the DNA test results from his pocket and threw them at her. "Read it," he said. Alice picked up the papers, her hands trembling. As she read the results, her world crumbled around her. "Mark, I can explain." "Don't bother," he interrupted, his voice cold and sharp. "I know everything. I know about John. I know about the lies. I've been living in a house full of strangers, Alice." Tears streamed down Alice's face. "I did it for us," she whispered. "You were jobless and we were struggling. I didn't know what else to do." Mark laughed bitterly. "For us? You call this for us? You destroyed everything, Alice. Everything." The argument grew heated, their voices echoing through the house. The girls huddled together in their room, covering their ears to block out the shouting. Finally, Alice made a decision. She couldn't let this continue. She packed a bag for the girls, tears blurring her vision as she stuffed clothes and essentials into a suitcase. "We're leaving," she told them, her voice trembling but firm. Mark didn't try to stop them. He watched as Alice and the girls walked out the door, his heart a twisted mess of anger, sadness, and regret. Alice sat in the waiting area of the police station, her hands trembling as she filled out the statement form. Her heart was heavy with guilt and fear, but she knew she had no choice. Protecting her daughters was her priority now. Lily and Emma sat beside her, clutching each other tightly. They hadn't spoken much since they left the house, their eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and relief. Alice glanced at them, her chest tightening. They were so young, so innocent. How had things come to this? Mark was arrested later that day. The news spread quickly among their social circle, whispers and rumors rippling through the elite community of Lagos. Once celebrated as a power couple, Alice and Mark were now the subject of scandal and gossip. When Alice returned to their empty home to gather more belongings, the weight of everything hit her. She sank onto the couch, sobbing into her hands. She had thought she was building a better life for her family, but her choices had torn them apart. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and therapy appointments. Alice moved the girls into a small, secure apartment on the other side of the city. It was a far cry from their luxurious home, but it felt safer. The girls began attending therapy sessions twice a week. The therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Grace, worked patiently with them, encouraging them to share their feelings. At first, they were reluctant, their voices barely above a whisper. "Can you tell me what you're feeling right now?" Dr. Grace asked during one session. Lily glanced at her sister before speaking. "I feel scared," she admitted. "What scares you?" Dr. Grace prompted gently. Lily hesitated, tears pooling in her eyes. "That he'll come back." Alice, sitting in the corner of the room, felt her heart shatter. She wanted to promise them that Mark would never hurt them again, but the trauma ran deep. Mark's trial was a painful experience for everyone involved. Alice was called to testify, recounting the horrors she had discovered. The courtroom was silent as she described the night she found him towering over the girls, the threats he had made, and the fear that had consumed their home. Mark sat across the room, his expression unreadable. When asked if he had anything to say, he stood and addressed the court. "I'm not proud of what I've done," he began, his voice low. "I let my anger control me. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and worthless. But that doesn't excuse my actions. I failed as a father, and for that I'm truly sorry." His words hung in the air, but they offered little comfort. The damage had already been done. Mark was sentenced to 10 years in prison. As the judge read the verdict, Alice felt a mix of relief and sorrow. She had loved Mark once, and a part of her still did, but the man she had married was gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized. Life after the trial was a struggle. Alice was determined to create a sense of normalcy for the girls, but it wasn't easy. Lily and Emma had nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night crying for their mother. Alice would rush to their side, holding them close and whispering reassurances. "I'm here," she would say, stroking their hair. "You're safe now." But safety didn't erase the memories. Alice's guilt was a constant companion. She blamed herself for everything, for betraying Mark, for bringing John into their lives, for not seeing the signs sooner. She poured her energy into therapy, attending sessions with the girls and seeking help for herself. One afternoon, during a family session, Lily spoke up. "Mom," she said hesitantly, "why did Daddy say we weren't his?" Alice froze. She had been dreading this moment, knowing that one day the truth would come out. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she reached for Lily's. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "Before your father got his job, we were struggling. We didn't have much money, and I was desperate to help him. I made a mistake, one I regret every single day." Emma tilted her head. "What mistake?" Alice swallowed hard. I made a deal with a man named John. He helped your father get his job, but it came at a cost. That's why your father said those things. But none of this is your fault. You're both my daughters, and I love you more than anything in this world." The girls stared at her, their young minds trying to process the complexity of her words. Finally Lily spoke. "Does that mean Daddy didn't love us?" Alice's eyes filled with tears. "No, sweetheart. He loved you very much. He was just hurting. And sometimes when people are hurting, they make bad choices." The conversation marked a turning point for their family. It wasn't an instant fix, but it opened the door for healing. Over time, the girls began to find their voices again. Therapy helped them process their emotions, and Alice worked tirelessly to rebuild their trust. She became more present, attending school events and planning small family outings. They weren't wealthy anymore, but they had each other, and that was enough. Time is a strange healer. For Alice and her daughters, Lily and Emma, the scars left by the past didn't fade overnight. They lingered, etched into their hearts and minds, but with every passing day, the sharp edges dulled, replaced by a fragile but growing strength. Alice devoted herself to building a new life for her family. She had lost the wealth and prestige they once enjoyed, but she was determined to give her daughters something far more valuable, a sense of safety, love, and stability. The small apartment in the outskirts of Lagos became their sanctuary. It wasn't lavish or filled with expensive decor, but it was warm and filled with laughter. Alice found a job at a local non-profit organization, where she used her skills to help women in difficult situations. The work was fulfilling, and it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The girls, too, were beginning to heal. Therapy sessions with Dr. Grace became a cornerstone of their recovery. Through play, art, and gentle conversations, the girls learned to express their emotions and confront their fears. One afternoon, during a particularly emotional session, Emma turned to her mother. "Mom," she said, her voice small but steady, "why did you stay with Daddy for so long? Even when he was mean?" Alice's heart ached at the question. She knelt down to Emma's level, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Because I didn't see what was happening, sweetheart," she admitted. "I thought I was protecting you by keeping our family together. But I made mistakes, and I'm so sorry for that. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you're safe and happy." Emma nodded, her young mind struggling to grasp the complexities of adult decisions. But her mother's honesty gave her a sense of comfort. The community they now lived in was different from the elite circles of their past. The neighbors were kind but curious, often asking about Alice's story. At first, she hesitated to share, fearing judgment. But over time, she realized that her experiences could help others. One evening, Alice was invited to speak at a women's support group. She stood before a room of women from all walks of life, her hands trembling as she began. "I'm not here to tell you I have all the answers," she said. "I've made mistakes that cost me my marriage and nearly destroyed my family. But I've learned that even in our darkest moments, we can find strength. We can rebuild." The room fell silent as she recounted her story, her voice breaking at times. By the end, many of the women were in tears, their own pain reflected in Alice's words. "Thank you for sharing," one woman said afterward. "Your courage gives me hope." Alice left the meeting feeling lighter than she had in years. Meanwhile, Mark was serving his sentence in prison. He had written several letters to Alice and the girls, but Alice kept them tucked away in a drawer. She wasn't ready to open them, and neither were the girls. Mark's time behind bars gave him plenty of time to reflect. He attended counseling sessions and joined a prison support group for fathers who had lost their families. Slowly, he began to understand the depth of his actions and the pain he had caused. One day, he wrote a letter to his daughters. "My dear Lily and Emma, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I need you to know how deeply sorry I am. I let my anger and pain consume me, and I failed you as a father. You didn't deserve what happened, and I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life. I hope one day when you're ready, you can find it in your hearts to forgive me. Until then, I will keep praying for your happiness. Love, Daddy." Alice debated whether to share the letter with the girls. After discussing it with Dr. Grace, they decided to wait until the girls were older and better equipped to process their emotions. Years passed, and the family continued to grow stronger. Lily developed a passion for painting, her artwork often reflecting her emotions. Emma, on the other hand, found solace in music, teaching herself to play the piano. Their talents became an outlet for their pain and a source of joy for their mother. One summer evening, as they sat on the balcony of their apartment, watching the sunset, Lily turned to Alice. "Mom, do you think we'll ever see Dad again?" she asked softly. Alice paused, considering her words carefully. "Maybe one day," she said. "But only if you're ready. It's your choice, and I'll support whatever you decide." Lily nodded, her expression thoughtful. The years that followed brought new opportunities and challenges. Alice's work at the non-profit flourished, and she became a beacon of hope for women in similar situations. Her story was one of resilience, a testament to the strength it takes to rebuild after tragedy. As for Lily and Emma, they grew into strong, compassionate young women. The trauma of their past didn't define them, but it shaped their empathy and understanding of the world. One day, as Alice looked at her daughters laughing together, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. They had survived the storm, and while the scars remained, they had found a way to heal. Life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough.